Alright, so the second book I'll be discussing this week is called One Last Word, Wisdom from the Harlem Renaissance, and it's an anthology collection of poems collected by Nikki Grimes, and she also wrote a couple of the poems in here. And Nikki Grimes is a children's author and poet, and she was born in Harlem in 1950, so a couple of decades after the Harlem Renaissance, but she still grew up in that geographical area, and she was very heavily influenced by that time period and by the works that came out of the Harlem Renaissance. And the anthology in this book, she actually collects the poems that aren't hers that she includes in the book are by Harlem Renaissance poets. So Nikki Grimes, she is an African-American author who grew up in Harlem in the 1950s, so in the midst of the Civil Rights era. And so not only is she using the experiences of those who grew up who were living in a period before her, a little bit closer to emancipation, so those who probably lived through slavery, who maybe were family members of slaves, and just using those experiences and trying to move on with their lives, but also reflecting on what happened to them. And so a bit about the Harlem Renaissance. It did start in Harlem in New York, which I think Harlem is a neighborhood in one of the main 5 boroughs in New York City. I think it might be in Brooklyn. And so Harlem, once slaves were emancipated in the South, a big majority of them actually migrated north. A lot of them migrated north because while they were finally freed, they were still facing quite a bit of discrimination down in the South. There were laws being put into place that were actively stopping them from being able to access the rights that other free citizens would have been able to access. Jim Crow made it very difficult for Black people in the South, and so many freed slaves and their families moved north, and a lot of them ended up settling in Harlem. And so in the late 1920s until I think about between early 1920s to the mid to late 1930s was when this concept of the Harlem Renaissance was taking place. And essentially what that was African Americans finally getting the chance to share their art, share their music, and share their literature. And it kind of became this explosion of culture coming out of Harlem at the time, and it ended up spreading out of the city, out of New York State, kind of having a big influence across the country, and was still influencing decades later. It very much influenced Nikki Grimes, who wasn't born until 1950. And so that's what the poems that weren't written by Nikki in here, they were written by poets from the Harlem Renaissance time period. And actually in the back of the book, she included biographies of the poets that she used. So Gwendolyn Bennett, I think Countee Cullen, Warren Cunny, they were all Harlem Renaissance poets, all of whom I think a couple of these pictures are deceiving in terms of color, but I think all of whom, if not most of whom, were African American at the time. Not at the time, they were just African American. They didn't change race or skin color. And so essentially what Nikki did in this book is she took some of the poems from poets who had influenced her, people like Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and so she took poems that they had written during the Harlem Renaissance, included them in this anthology, their actual poems, and then she in turn created her own poems in response to their poems. And how she did this was she used a poem form called golden shovel poetry. And essentially what happens in golden shovel poetry is you take the line of a poem or the entirety of a poem itself if it's relatively short, and you take each word, and each word that you use from the poem, I'll call it the foundation poem, from the foundation poem that you find, you use it in turn, and you use each of those words, and each of those words becomes the last word of each of your poetry lines. So for example, she had a poem in here, So she took a poem, Storm Ending, by Jean Toomer, and you can see that first line is kind of bolded, and so she took those bolded words, so thunder blossoms gorgeously above our heads. She bolded those 6 words, and then on the next page, she ends up writing her own poem, Truth, and you can see at the end of each line, the words that she took from the first line of Jean Toomer's poem are bolded, and they're at the end of each of her lines. So that's Golden Shovel poetry, and it's kind of difficult to explain, but that's how all of her poem responses are in this. And for some of the poems that she took, she ended up using the entire poem. Some of them she just took a line, but each poem that she wrote in response, whatever poem she had taken from one of the Harlem Renaissance poets, she in turn took their words and made them the last words of the lines of her poem. And so I ended up actually doing that. I ended up making a Golden Shovel poem, and it is not easy, and the writing process is very difficult. And so I didn't actually take a mentor text, I didn't take a mentor text from this anthology. I actually went back to when I had taken RE 3240, which is World Children's Literature, which I took back in sophomore year of undergrad with Brooke Harden, who's no longer at ASU. And we actually ended up doing a poetry portfolio. And so we included a bunch of different poem forms. We did haikus, we did found poems, which is you like find a work of literature and you kind of turn it into a poem. And I actually ended up using a very interesting Twitter feed that I found for that one. But we had also made this poem form called So Much Depends Upon, and it was actually based on a poem that we studied. And so I actually took a few lines from my own poem of So Much Depends Upon. And so I'll go ahead and read the So Much Depends Upon poem, and I'll tell you guys which lines I used, and then I'll read you my Golden Shovel poem. And so each word of the lines that I chose for my So Much Depends Upon poem become the last word of each line in my Golden Shovel poem. All right, so this is my So Much Depends Upon poem. So much depends upon a comforting hug, encircling me in support, shielding me from harsh words and hurtful actions, an act of unconditional love. So in that poem, I took they're kind of in the middle, 3 middle lines, a comforting hug, encircling me in support, shielding me. So that's 9 words. That's 9 words that I took, and so each of those 9 words I kind of took and put in a separate document, and I put them at the end, so you kind of like orient it and you kind of right shift. So instead of being left oriented or center oriented, your words are on the right, so that like each last word is very obvious and it's not a hunt to find. So if you look kind of going down like an acrostic, my last words would be like a comforting hug, encircling me in support, shielding me. So my golden poem for this, I entitled it Safe. And my golden poem is, open arms offer me a solace at the end of a day, comforting me with pressure and warmth. His hug is home. His presence and a smell encircling everything bad from the day, pushing it away from me. All of the stress, all of the emotions that I keep in, I let out, I share, knowing that I have his support. His arms lower my defenses, and his hug is shielding me from the doubts in my own head, protecting me from me. So, it's not as great as anything that Nikki Grimes came up with in her anthology that she collected here, but for what it is and for the difficulty of this poetry form that I had never heard of until I read this book, I'm kind of proud of it. I was originally going to do the entirety of my So Much Depends Upon poem, but that was a lot, and a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be, so I actually had to keep going back and editing and trying to think of not only a poem that flowed cohesively on its own, but then could each end in those words at the end of the lines, and that was what was the most difficult part, because on its own, those lines had made up, a section of a poem that had already made sense. I'd already made one, but then separating them on their own and trying to come up with a way to include them and not just in an acrostic way, not like, a comforting hug. but trying to make the rest of the poem just as cohesive was very difficult. I really appreciated that challenge though, because I really like this poem style. It's a very interesting form, and like I said, I hadn't heard of it before, but I think it offers an interesting view, and I think using other people's poetry, even going back into your own poems, can really encourage also like a little bit of comprehension. And I hate saying, interpret this poem, because there's never any one right answer, because we all interpret poetry differently. Thanks, EOG, for those awful questions. But I think it can offer some comprehension, like what is the author trying to say in this part, and how might I relate that to my poem, or how do I not relate it? Do I just want to take the words and just completely dissociate them from their original writing? And so yeah, that was One Last Word. And so the poems that she took from other poets were kind of set in the Harlem Renaissance time period. Hers were written a little bit later, early 2000s, and so there was a little bit of setting change within that, more in the time periods. Since it was a poem anthology, there weren't really characters. She did mention some people by name in her poems, Nikki Grimes did, and I tried to look them up to see if maybe they were her children, her family, but I couldn't really find much on her personal life. So yeah, that was One Last Word, a very interesting little book, some beautiful poetry. And as much as writing the Golden Shovel poem was a challenge, I really like that form, and I think it's a very interesting thing to do with poetry, because there are so many forms, and this is one that I hadn't heard of until grad school. So that's all for One Last Word. Thanks.